Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to join the Women in Mathematical Sciences seminar today. Today's seminar will be recorded. I'm honored to have Julia Jebsen as our speaker. She is a researcher specializing in women's successful career progression in academic STEM careers. Her background is in occupational psychology, but she also collaborates with other STEM subject specialists on projects relating to gender inequality in STEM and research careers. Julia has previously worked at the University of Wolverhampton and the University of Glasgow, and will start a new role as a lecturer in organization psychology next year. So let's welcome Julia. Julia, it's all yours.
All right, thank you for coming, everyone. I'll share my screen. Is that working?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. So my name is Julie. I'm here to talk to you about women in mathematics, but also broadly about women in STEM and other people in STEM. It's broader than the title would assume. If you have any questions or comments, we're very willing to hear that. There's a chat function you can use here. If you're not so willing to send a question publicly, then you can email me, or you can find me on Twitter, or you can send a question to Joanna, who organised this with help. What my research is predominantly about is something called the leaky pipeline, and this is exemplified by this graph here. You see that there are, in STEM subjects in the UK, in the academic year 2018, broadly half and half, actually a few more women than men, 51.63% women at undergraduate level, jumps up a few percentage points for postgraduate study, but then something happens. As soon as the academic career starts, women are somehow lost, and that loss is increased all the way to professor. And professor is important because as a measure of careers, if you want to do research or teaching, professor is as far as you can go in most UK academic careers. And that's where women are the most underrepresented. In the UK, only 22.6% of women, or all professors are women. If you look at women in maths, it gets a bit worse. Here, only 11.42% of all professors are women. Starting out with fewer undergraduates than you see in other STEM careers, only 37.39% of undergraduate women, undergraduates in maths are women. And then you can see continued loss of women where they leak out of this career pipeline to professor. If you compare maths to STEM, so the bottom two lines are women, the top two lines are men. The very bottom is women in maths. You see this continued effect, where we seem unable to retain women. There are three main vulnerabilities in the leaky pipeline. You've got recruitment, retention, and selection. So you first of all need to recruit women into STEM and mathematical sciences to study, and then we need to be able to retain them to postgraduate degrees into academic careers and progress them all the way to the top of their potential. You can look at the leaky pipeline like this, but you could also look at all the women who work in mathematics. How many are professors? In that case, it's only 8.96%, whereas 19.79% of all men in maths are professors. And if you look at all staff of everyone who works in mathematics, only 2% are female professors. So there's definitely something very wrong going on where we're not able to recruit, retain, and progress women. A bit about these figure points. The student data is collected from the Higher Education Statistics Agency. They are the largest and the only complete data we have on the academic population. So everyone who studies and everyone who works in academia, Higher Education Statistics Agency have that. They don't release everything by subject for staff level. So I've used that data from Advanced AG. That is not a complete data set. It's every data set submitted through Athena's One data and Race Equality Charter. So if you your organization submit to Advanced AG, all that contributes to this really big Advanced AG data set. But it's the most specific available and it is large. And where there are overlap between Higher Education Statistics Agency and Advanced AG, the proportions look very accurate for Advanced AG, even if the tally doesn't quite add up. But it's not just women who have a disproportionately hard time in becoming promoted to professor. Across subjects, 26.7% of professors are women, and 90.89% of these are white. In mathematical sciences, there continues to be a gender, sorry, my cat is attacking me, gender disparity, but you also see them for other protected characteristics. For example, it's disproportionately harder for people with non-disabilities to become promoted to professor, and also for people of color. And it seems to be particularly vulnerable for Black people, and especially in STEM careers. So even though they affect us in across subjects, it's especially in STEM. We don't have data for LGBTQ because it's not just recorded. So if you work in an organization where that can be, then absolutely push for it, because we need the disparities measured across the board. The goal is not just to make academia more inclusive for women. We need to make academia a space where everyone can access and they can contribute, thrive, and progress to their fullest potential. When we talk about STEM and which subjects, you can have often seen different acronyms. We originally started with STEM with 2 M's to include medicines. It used to be science, technology, engineering, maths, and medicine. And then it was agreed that, well, some thought that medicine is a science, so it was included in the S, and then some thought, well, medicine doesn't have the same vulnerabilities, especially in terms of recruitment of women into medicine, so they didn't include that. But this is what HESA, the largest data body, defines as STEM careers, and they often now refer to just this set. But why do women not progress then? If they're there initially, at least in some subjects, why do they not progress? Some argue that if they had been good enough, they would have done. And if you look at the systematic evidence for that, Janet Hyde has done a meta-analysis which included a range of cognitive variables, including ability, verbal and non-verbal communication, social and personality factors, psychological well-being, and motor skills. And the only variables that really had any significant gender differences were motor skills, and specifically about throwing abilities like velocity and distance, which rarely explains why some people become professor in STEM and some don't. And what's really important about this is that if we treat genders as though they are intellectually different, or they're different in terms of their abilities, then you create these false senses of what some people can and can't do, and that comes to the cost of women's opportunities in their careers, and it's just not supported by systematic evidence. Another very important common claim is that academia is a fair place, and if people don't progress, it's just because they're not good enough, because academia is a meritocracy. People progress based on their merits. But the measures of merits, especially those that are valued in promotional processes and recruitment processes, are biased against women. And you see this from the start of the careers all the way to the top. Corinne Moss-Rakusin did an excellent study where she has sent out identical CVs to different lab heads in science subjects, some subjects. The only difference was that they were either attributed to a male or a female candidate. And the lab heads were asked to evaluate their CV, if they would hire that person and what salary they would offer. And men were more likely to be shortlisted for a position, and they would be offered more money. In her study, you see other studies like that. The women are less likely to get good references. If you have early career, high achieving women in maths compared to equally qualified men, the women are 3 times less likely to be shortlisted for an interview. And that goes all the way up to the top of the career, and especially when you come into careers that involve jobs that involve more leadership, men are more likely to be judged against their potential to what they could be, but women are more judged against their proven performance or what they already have done to secure that position. And those judgments are made equally by men and women. All of this seems to stem from what is attributed as a chilly climate, meaning that the culture, the shared value, the set of ways how we do things is colder and more exclusionary to women. Women are less likely to access networks, and they're less likely to benefit from opportunities with high promotional value, all the whilst facing bullying, harassment, lack of support. This is great, isn't it? This is what you want to hear when you're an early career woman. I'm sorry if it's a bit downhearted, but it does get better, I promise. No one loves admin in academia. No one thinks we need more of it, but what we have seen is that when there are efforts to reduce the amount of paperwork and bureaucracy, specifically in promotional processes, this disadvantages women's career progression. Because there is already a lot, as this research and my research has found, of informal processes involved in getting promoted in academic careers. And when you reduce bureaucracy, you increase the ambiguity of how the procedures work. You reduce the ambiguity of how the criteria should be made accessible, how they're interpreted, who interprets them, and all of that ends up making it even harder for women to become promoted. As an example of that, the research has found that in such environments where there is ambiguity, men are 48.7 times more likely to report the promotional criteria is clear. There's a really good report come out last year of the research integrity of UK research, which extends to research institutes in addition to academic institutions. And they found that 90% of participants described the research integrity as compromised at least some of the time. And everyone, but especially women, were concerned about raising issues relating to research integrity because of the fear of backlash. And my research also found that it's not just a fear of backlash, there are actual consequences to women raising issues that criticizes and threatens the powers that be. which can have very real outcomes for their career progression. And this relates more to organizational structures rather than individuals making bad decisions. It's about the spaces and the structures that allows individuals to make bad decisions. You see that universities that explicitly identifies as meritocracies are more likely to recruit a man over a woman when they're equally qualified. And just like with Corinne Moss recruiting study, men are also likely to be offered more money. Most of the leaders we have in UK universities are white men, able-bodied men, and they rate their institutions as culture fair, as meritocratic, but then prioritize excellence over diversity. And that is a fallacy, because diversity is excellent. You cannot have excellence in academia or in research if you don't use all of your potential in all your staff. If not everyone get to contribute, you can't have excellence. You get a very narrow set of what success looks like, of what merits look like, and no one is advantaged by that. Another explanation for the leaky pipeline and why women don't progress is linked to research funding. In many STEM subjects, having research funding is the only way you do research. And that means that you get a perpetuating effect. If you don't get research funding, then you have to take on more tasks that are related to often academic citizenship and teaching and administrative tasks, which leaves less time to continue applying for funding, and you get this spiraling effect, self-perpetuating effect of people being phased out of research when they don't win funding. The largest research council in UK research and innovation is the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And over a decade, they found that a report released last year revealed that women have only won 14% of the EPSRC grants won by men. And that is partially attributed to women submitting fewer applications. But when women submit applications, they are disproportionately less likely to win funding, and they also win less of the funding they asked for compared to men. Even though they won 14% of the grant funding won by men, they submitted 31% of the applications. You can add to this again with intersectionality of other marginalised backgrounds. Freedom Information request submitted by Dr. Adi Adelaine showed that in the financial year 2019-20, Black individuals were awarded 8% of the funding they asked for, compared to 32% of white colleagues. And if you look at all the principal investigators of that academic year, only 0.43% were Black. The funding, as for the other career progression factors, don't just impact women, they impact other marginalised background as well. And we can very much see, although currently there just isn't data supported or released that is detailed enough, but there will be an intersectionality effect where women of colour will suffer disproportionately. And it goes on, and it goes on. So for example, women win fewer awards for their contributions. This is a graph from last year for the Nobel Prize, but it doesn't matter because no women won a Nobel Prize for science this year. Women are rated lower in publications and teaching evaluations and the professional awards. Just as a little tip about the awards, people win awards because they were nominated. So one thing we can do about this is to get nominating. Do take time to find out what the meaningful awards are within your subjects and nominate people who don't represent the people who would typically win these awards. one last things I want to talk about before I start on my research is a book written by Sheryl Sandberg, and it's called Lean In. It primarily argues that women don't progress in their careers. She's CEO of Facebook. So a bit more on the technology side and industry rather than academic careers, but she still argues that there are opportunities, it's just women don't lean into them. Instead, they lean away, they lean back from meaningful challenges to their careers because they're so worried about the work-life balance. There's something called the Hawking Index, which was set up after it's been becoming so common to download books and read them digitally, which allows for a bit of different ways of measuring how much people complete books, in addition to how many are sold. Stephen Hawking released his book, The Brief History of Time, which a lot of people meant to read, but it's one of the least finished books. Although I'm sure it's very good compared to this one. Lean In is in Amazon amongst the most downloaded, but also least finished books they got on their systems on the Hawking Index. As Professor Michelle Ryan says, make of that what you will. I think this is a huge pragmatic approach to women's careers because it is very much a fix the woman approach, the lean in arguments. It assumes that women's careers are not in any way impacted by any organizational or contextual factors, which we know they are. And it also ignores the barriers that other marginalized groups face. And it leads to this approach to just teaching women to cope with the challenges rather than addressing the systematic differences that women face. And if the leaky pipeline is broken, you don't complain to the water that it's leaking. You get a plumber and you fix the pipes, you fix the system. I've been very lucky to be part of two very large projects. One of them is a project supported by EPSRC, one of the few supported to women PIs. All these top 3 names are the PIs for that research project. Is now finished. And it was a study on early career women in engineering across 3 Scottish universities. And they looked at their networking, collaborative behaviours. And they did many things in that book to draw out some of the key points. They looked at how these early career women in engineering did their networking. And they found that initially, their networks were very small. They were often centered around their PIs or the line manager rather than themselves. They tended to be very close clustered, so like their immediate lab partners. And they weren't too connected. But what can only be described as throwing interventions at these very, very lucky early career engineers, the postdocs in engineering, they offered them tons of training, they offered them small support, big support, they offered them individual coaching, they had training in how to increase your digital footprint, they had training in very specific things sometimes, like if you're at a conference and you see a group of people and there's someone that you want to talk to, but they're over there and they know each other and they're chatting and you're over there with a cup of coffee, and how do you take that cup of coffee and introduce yourself and make yourself part of that conversation at the conference? They did training for all these things, as well as throwing a big conference for them where they got to showcase their strengths, their research, to network. They offered collaboration partners to come in. It was a great project. And what they found at the end then was that the networks broadened up, they became more meaningful, they became filled with more meaningful contacts that they had actual collaborations with, they became centered around themselves. Yeah, I'll talk a bit more about it later, but it was a great project and there's more to it, and there's lots of publications if you want to read more. what I've done, this is an outdated presentation of a picture of the leaky pipeline, but I really like how it really shows it as a leaking pipeline and not just as a dotted graph. My research question for my PhD has been to identify the individual and organizational factors that contribute to women achieving professor status in STEM. All the women I have interviewed have been professors in a STEM subject. They've all been based in the UK, but they haven't necessarily been from the UK. I interviewed 71 of them, which is huge for a qualitative study, and that's where a PhD is such a good project to do it, because you have that timeline, which you normally wouldn't do. I found the professors sometimes through looking at staff websites, but particularly Twitter was important. I sent out a tweet asking to get in touch with female professors because I want to interview them about their careers for my study, and that was largely where I got all my participants from. They used their networks from the ones I've got in touch with there, and they kind of snowballed. So I was very lucky in how many professors I was able to interview. I did semi-structured interviews, which means I had the same questions that I asked everyone, but there was room to ask additional follow-up questions if I felt that was necessary. And that was then transcribed with a verbatim approach, which is a kind of like warts and all approach, where you transcribe every word as it was said. You don't clean the sentences, you don't clean the language, every cough, everything is there. And it added to just over 500,000 words, 1,664 pages of data. And in that transcription, anonymization has been very, very important. So you'll see some quotes soon, and all those quotes are attributed to pseudonyms. So because these are all women in sciences, I've given them pseudonyms of famous women in science, but I didn't interview Marie Curie, for example. It's just a pseudonym. I've also hidden other names of employers, people, places, years, anything that could reveal their identities. And then I analysed it with reflexive thematic analysis, which means I've gone through all the interviews and I looked for what's called repeated pattern of meaning. So what kept coming up, what was repeatedly brought up as the most important. And that's what I found. I'm not going to present to you all my themes and my findings. We're going to focus on the cherry selected bits. That means, what can we do as individuals? If you can't change the way universities run, we can't change the way UKRI are doing their funding, what can we do as individuals? And that's what we're going to highlight now. First of all, I want to point out that all these women were very, very diverse. One of the things I thought I would do, which I very quickly dismissed, was this sense of creating a CV or an idea of what a typical female professor would look like. And that is partly the problem, that we're looking for this template. And that is a barrier to women's career progression, because professorial CVs look very different, not just between subjects, but within one subject and within specialisms. They're very, very diverse. And that was what this sample represented. I interviewed women who had very privileged backgrounds and women who did not. I interviewed women who'd always done really well in school and got straight into very good universities. And I interviewed women who failed their A-levels. One of them said because she had better things to do. But they all obviously did really well at the end. But if you feel like you're not on the particularly special path, that you don't come from a special background, then that's fine. Because all of I own them. All these women shared that, and they still did really well. I thought they would have a strong sense of ambition because they persevered and they were resilient against so much. but actually career ambition wasn't really a prominent feature in these women. They often had a love of learning. They had a sense of wanting to do teaching or to do research, and that's what they pursued rather than a title. And you could maybe see that as a gender because there's so much less support for women in their career progression. But we also need to consider that in addition to these objective career goals, it's very convenient to create a leaky pipeline and say a professor is a goal if you want to do research or teaching. But that undermines subjective career goals, because that was something that came out as much more important, that the women had set the goals of what they wanted to do in teaching, in research, in what they wanted to contribute to their field. And it wasn't always tremendously important whether they did that as professors or not. When I asked them, more than half of the interviewed professors didn't remember when they became professor. Another takeaway point from all these interviews is that there are things you can do for you. And even though they're hard, and it can be getting educational qualifications, it can be getting a teaching qualifications, it can be doing getting the promotion or other things that reflects personal qualifications. It increases your independence and your career mobility. So if you're not sure that if any of you are doing a PhD and you're not quite sure where that will lead to, it's something that is there for you, that you take with you. And it's not always the goal that everyone stays in academia, but it should be their choice. It shouldn't be academia rejecting some people more than others. One of the strongest points that came out in the interviews was that social support is absolutely critically essential. It was something that had to be in place, and if it wasn't in place, they wouldn't have become professors. And that is not just because we need the emotional support of a community, but because we need the information that is shared through social networks. And we need to have that support from each other. If you feel like you want to do something, then just make sure you do support each other. Often women were just really busy coping with their work, and they didn't think about promotions until someone else pointed it out to them. And sometimes that was a line manager, but most often it was not. It was someone else in their social network who recommended, I think you're doing a great job. Have you thought about promotion? And that started the decision-making process of applying. One of the things that's often highlighted is as an explanation for why we don't have enough women in senior positions such as professors is that we don't have role models, and you can't be where you can't see. And that is partly true. It is supported by evidence that having role models is important to careers. Tekla Morgenroth has done great work on this. Having role models can make career goals seem realistic, that can make them seem attractive, and all that is important. But what is important about role models is not just that women are important role models to other women. Women can be important role models to everyone. It's very important that everyone see women as realistic and desirable goal achievers. They fulfill these roles, they make them seem attractive to everyone. And the same goes for people of other marginalized backgrounds. We need to see a broader LGBTQ plus representation in our leaders, and we need to see people of color represented too. However, there's a very important caveat to that, because so many of the women I spoke to were professors, or they had professors, but they moved on to other titles, sometimes very senior in careers and at universities and central management. When you are the only person, or one of the very few from a specific background, you stand out from a majority, whatever the majority is, quite often your individual identity become lost and you have a social identity. So the women often explain that they didn't want to take on, for example, a certain role, or they weren't sure if they wanted to be a professor or if they wanted to be head of department, but they felt like if they didn't do it, they showed to the whole department that women don't want it. And that can be quite the burden and something we need to be mindful of. So when we highlight all these individuals, there is an emotional labor task associated with that. In addition to role models, mentoring also kept coming up as very, very important. Very few had had the mentoring experience, which could be explained by how especially formally arranged mentoring schemes are relatively recent and new. But it was something that was highlighted as very, very important, and not just in the early career stages. Often we assume that a mentoring relationship is someone very senior who gives advice and support to someone who's early career, and then when they give all their advice, they're done. Some mentoring relationships lasted a very long time, but also some of them were shorter. And there were also an issue raised around when you're assigned a mentor, that can be a very intimate relationship. And it's not always filtered out in terms of what people need and what they want from being a mentor or being a mentee. So it can be mapped with someone who might have achieved a lot, but not every mentor is willing and able to give that level of support and that kind of a very personal attachment. It can be hard to subscribe or to be assigned by others. It can feel artificial. And equally, some of the women said that they had a mentor and they did a great job. And they didn't mind that it was a man. They didn't necessarily always want a woman, but they weren't receptive at that stage to advice. Sometimes you do need to make your own mistakes. But it doesn't mean stop all formally assigned mentoring relationships, because there are interviewed women in my study who said they didn't have any mentoring, not formal, not informal, nothing. And they would much rather have a formal mentoring assigned to them that might work than not to have any and then feel like it was something they very much wanted and would benefit from. From that, I would very much recommend that you think broadly around mentoring and networking. If you look at both the VisNet project and this PhD, they can make a critical difference, meaning that the career progression wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened that fast. It wouldn't happen at all if it hadn't been for the mentors. But think about what you would want from a mentor and who could be that. I very much don't recommend monogamy in mentoring, because different people have so much to offer and they're very different areas of expertise. And even though it is a very intimate relationship, it can be exhausting to keep establishing that with loads of different people. Do seek advice from more than one source. And the same goes with networking. And both of those, I recommend that we consider using people who are not just more senior to us, more progressed, but look at people who are peers and sometimes more junior as well, because there is a lot of strength to offer, especially in terms of networking. Networking more broadly than just upwards is hugely important, because network can take so long before they become productive and you can reap some kind of benefit or reward from it. Information is shared, workloads are shared, so many real tangible benefits are associated with having good mentoring and good networking. That's something we can definitely do if we can't change the way the funding works. And then one of the last things I want to point out is that as an organizational barrier, most academic workloads are not known for being light or easily managed, and not having enough time to even think about promotions or what you need to do to get there is a barrier. So again, this is partly where the support comes in, where people can recommend to each other that they might be ready when others are just trying to keep their head above water. If you're in a position to do something with workloads, I very much recommend looking at this specific barrier to promotion. It's not just that people need time to submit the, especially professorial application is a hugely time-consuming activity, but also they need space in their workloads for professional development, and not just general stuff, but the kind of work development, professional development that is valued in promotions. So key takeaway points I've got are, there's no such thing as a typical professor. They come from all sorts of backgrounds. They took different routes. My professors were in and out of industry careers and academic careers. They did loads of different things. They started as mature students, and they were very different from each other. And thinking about people in terms of fitting in mold and thinking about past success as a template for future success is a barrier. We all need support and encouragement. And this is something where, this is an area where individuals and organizations can do a lot more. Organizations specifically who work on improving the formal processes of measuring performance and progression, especially in terms of accessibility of criteria and the process, and how clear the criteria are, because there has to be some ambiguity because not everyone fits the same template. It has to be clear enough that people know what they're working towards. Individuals can support each other, be a kind of, especially now, we need more kindness in the world. Form broader networks, be mentors, and use a digital footprint. That's specifically important in the VisNet project. Don't underestimate the power of good Twitter accounts. I found so many of my participants there, so it directly benefited my research. I then, through that, also did networking with someone who I then later wrote a paper with, and that paper with that specific person led to the VisNet post coming up, because initially there was another postdoc working on that and she got another job, and they had a few months left and they didn't have anyone to do the work, and then I was available. So forming the broader networks and using a digital footprint is very important. And consider how people can be helpful, how they can be mentors. If you want sounding boards, if you want direct advice, there are very many people who can offer that advice. And also, if you want to find them, be that mentor back to others. And that is it for me. I would love to hear your questions and comments and thoughts.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Julie. This was very, very interesting. So we have plenty of time for questions. And if you would like to ask a question, please pop it in the chat. And when, I will read out the questions and we can have a conversation. You're also welcome to turn on your camera if you want to ask it in person. Yeah. Oh. So I thought I would ask a question just to kick off the discussion a little bit. And this relates to the first comment that people made. There's a lot of things that we can do as individuals, but essentially we're still the minority. So how far can we get if it's essentially not only women? I know there are some men non-binary, there's plenty of people that are in this space kind of helping, but the majority are not really present. Even, this is a 1 hour presentation, but even the best meaning people would say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm too busy, I have this and this and the other. So essentially, how much can we change just from our end? That's sort of expressing a little bit also my frustration.
Yeah. So what I thought was fun, but the title of my PhD is a quote taken from one of the participants, and it's just a big sigh. And then she says, it's a whole lot of not giving up. That's a quote for it all. Some of the professors said that they were quiet and well behaved until they became professor, and then they started demanding change.
Yeah, I definitely feel, I think I'm starting to feel now that they've been at my workplace for a long time, and I don't really worry about being a troublemaker. I definitely feel more comfortable to be more vocal.
Yeah, great.
We have a question by Barbara Jomolai. Would you like to turn on your camera and microphone?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and it was a great talk. Maybe one observation. So there are obviously female professors, and they get there because they are very talented, getting grants, etc., etc. I'm talking about mathematics. But most of the researchers maybe don't have the capacity to become professors, but they still would like to progress to become senior lecturers, readers, etc., etc. So what is the percentage of female mathematicians in these positions which are below the professorship? And again, do you think that this is still a problem? There is a large gap compared to men? Thank you.
That's a great question. So first of all, even though traditionally you become promoted to professor by being excellent at research, the field is broadening up a lot, and some universities are stronger driving forces in those different routes. So teaching is becoming a far more common professorial route now, which is great because they're taking a long time to get rid of this criteria of internationally recognized as expert, and that's very difficult to achieve within a teaching route, but is becoming done now. And you're very right that there are tasks that are necessary to do for universities to run efficiently that are not recognized in promotional criteria, but that is changing. Currently, 35.98% of all not quite yet professors are women. And there are different university structures. So you have postdocs. This is everyone in these percentages are on academic contracts. You got postdocs, lecturers, senior lecturers, readers. Then some universities, a senior lecturer is for teaching and a reader is for research. And then some universities have replaced one or both of those with associate professor. And then some also introduced assistant professor. But it gets worse, because at some universities, associate professor is below assistant professor, and it's not at all consistent, which is why we just call it not professor in the graphs. Women are underrepresented. It's not as bad as at professor level, but it's becoming increasingly common for other routes. So definitely don't give up. I think there are lots of people who are fully capable of becoming professors on different routes. I interviewed several who had become professors on leadership tracks, on teaching tracks, on entrepreneurial tracks. And even though that was not common, those that ice is being broken and the precedence is being set at different university, which makes it easier to follow. And also, as a slight advantage, if that hasn't been done at your department, then your CV can be the one that can show what a teaching or what alternative routes to professor can look like if it's different to those who typically have become professor in your department so far. So if you haven't, if that's something that you want as a goal for you, that's great. Then it can be that. And I find that often it helps to approach those who make the promotional decisions, the committees, and ask what they're looking for. And if they are amenable, don't assume that they're not looking for anyone outside of research. have some discussions and find out what their thinking is about that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know UCL, they've recently made lots of changes in promotions process, which might be interesting for you to look at. There's now a full teaching track all the way to professor. And
Yes,
also the
right.
criteria have become much more broad ranging, I think.
Yeah, and that will be because there were women who fought for it.
Yeah,
And there
thank
were
you to you.
who fought for it. So that's fantastic. So absolutely do celebrate the ones who've done that.
Yeah, we have a question by Sonia. Sonia, would you like to turn on your microphone, or shall I ask your question? I'll go for it. So you didn't mention much about parenthood and caring responsibilities. Did participants talk about that?
Yes, very much so. There are a lot of different approaches or kind of responses to parental care and leave in academia. There are some universities like Oxford and Cambridge, it used to be, not one in my sample, but there used to be a rule that if you were employed as a woman, you had to get permission from your employer to get married. And you also had to get permission from your employer to have children. And your employer couldn't say, no, you can't have children, but they could say, you can't have children and keep your job. And again, with these huge excessive workloads, it becomes very difficult to have time off. And some subjects like technology, the fields develop very quickly. And then it becomes hard to come back and catch up on everything if you're taking time off. But that also applies to sick leave. So it becomes an ableist issue in addition to a parental care issue, and that often disproportionately affect women. But networks can help there. But yeah, they very much did find that. Not so much recently, but some of the professors who I interviewed who started their careers a long time ago, one of them declared to her line manager that she was pregnant, and he stood up, slammed his hands on the desk and said, "You're a fool." But as one of the other professors I interviewed said, where do they think baby scientists come from? There's a huge demand for scientists in academic careers and out of it. There's more than 3 available STEM jobs for every STEM currently enrolled student in the UK. It's a huge marketplace. We're never going to fulfill that if you don't look at all the people in the world, that we could possibly use.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to the next person is Gina, who said, it was mentioned at the beginning. Oh, so the question is about the number of women who attended today. How do we get more men involved in this conversation, since they're often in positions of power to enact change? What were your thoughts about that while you were doing your research?
Realistically, you're not going to get everyone. But there are people, men are not the enemy, first of all. And when you're talking about things being harder for women, or you're talking about things like white privilege, often people hear an accusation that if you're a man and if you're white, that you haven't had a difficult life, or if you haven't fought and worked hard to get to where you are, which is not at all true. It just meant that your gender or your race was not a barrier in your progression to where you are. It's making it clear that you're not making any kind of attacking accusation, but make a very specific plan for what you want changed and have good evidence to support it. And that's what I'm hoping I can now contribute with. I've done talks at other places where I've brought up stuff and someone's come up after and said, we talked about this, we told our dean, and then dean said, but you're just 3 people. If we change everything 3 people want, we will never get anywhere. So make sure you have the good evidence for it. And there are lots of low-hanging fruits and very specific things we can do. So making sure that you have evidence, for example, to say that we understand that you want to reduce the bureaucracy around the promotional processes, but this continued to disadvantage women. And you don't want to disadvantage women because that's the bad thing and you're a good guy. So of course you want to do this. And these are the specific steps that you can do that make you look really good. There's lots of that can be done. For example, you can say now with all these reports that are coming out about funding inequalities, it's easier to say that prioritizing securing grant funding as a promotional criteria disadvantage not just women, but all these other groups. And using that evidence to negotiate how important that criteria is. And if you formalize the promotional process, where you leave less space for people to make individual judgments, but it was always important, why should it stop being important now? All of that will help. I'm very disappointed that Athena Swan got taken off as a criteria for UKRI funding, because it used to be. It's no longer. They claimed it was too onerous, the process, and they're doing something else, but it's not quite clear what they're doing to demand equality, diversity, and inclusion efforts. But yeah, if you want to do something as an individual and you want to not just focus on what you can do, but to influence the processes and the systemic inequalities, then I would recommend influencing where you can how performance and promotional criteria are used. And I'm very happy to provide evidence and articles and things for that.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. I'm going to go next to Fiona. She's had her hand up for a while, and then we'll go to Komal.
Oh, yeah. I just wondered, because in the sort of the structures of the university and progression are very much based on rewarding overwork. You've got to get X amount of publications or, X amount of presentations and get this, network that you do by working in your own time. And I just wondered, and that obviously disadvantages, well, women who are primarily, the prime caregivers. It also disadvantages people with disabilities. It disadvantages people who are having to, deal with racism, homophobia, whatever. And I just wondered whether, as a department, we're doing quite a bit to try and get the university to recognise things like citizenship, being on committees as things that kind of should work towards progression. I just wondered whether you'd come across anything that helped to challenge this concept of overwork and try and kind of level the playing field that way, I suppose.
Yeah. So one of the most important things then would be to look at all the things that would need to be done to keep university running and then line up promotional criteria instead of looking at just this very narrow section of research success. Because there are some, I find that there's other researchers argued that there are some subjects that are ranked higher than others. But I found that within subjects, there are specialisms that are ranked higher than others. So within some specialisms, for example, within psychology, experimental work gets published in different papers than very applied stuff. So if you look at impact factor, that becomes something that disadvantages people because or women, because women typically don't do the experimental work. They get these kind of specialism hierarchies as well. Something that does help is to look at what criteria are and are they available. So for example, it's hugely important to recognize academic citizenship as a criteria, but make sure that it's not just criteria that aren't available. So if you need to lead a committee and there aren't any committees available to lead, then that criteria become inaccessible. The leadership thing also becomes important in that people don't get recognized for contributing to projects if they don't lead it, especially in the more senior promotion, like professors. It's more important to be PI than co-I. Considering that is very important. And then some of the universities that are done best have different pillar approaches, so you can express your strength across the board. You can look at, for example, having applied for specific sums instead of have one funding sums. All of that makes a difference. But looking at more success beyond just research success is important, because if everyone stopped teaching because it's not really promotionally rewarded, the universities would collapse. And we need not just to reward having done teaching, but having done it well. And that needs to be measured in a different way than how we measure how research is done well. Does any of that help?
Thank you. Lots of food for thought. I'm trying to make notes at the same time. So Kamal, would you like to turn on your microphone? Hi.
Yes, hi, thanks, Ian. And thanks, Julie, for a really fantastic talk. Many years ago, I sat on the Athena Swan committee when I was just a PhD student. I was like, I want to understand how all of this works. So thanks for sharing so much data. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the motherhood, the so-called motherhood penalty, separate to the issues around caring, because I'm kind of interested in how, the first few years of having children, pregnancy, lactation, until children get to school, etc. And I'm quite interested in how, as academics, we're expected to navigate that, and just how difficult it is looking at academia and how unwelcoming it is of young children and families in general. And I was wondering if there's any insights from your data that you could.
Thank you, that's a very good question. So I think it comes back to the work-life balance, because the core issue of taking maternity leave is that you choose for a period your own personal life above work. And the workload is kind of set so even though nobody I've talked to is formally required to stay in more than 40 hours a week, those who do are rewarded. There are ways we can try to influence, for example, if criteria are used in a time limit. So how much have you done in the last year in terms of what does your whole CV and your whole experience reflect? Because you might have lows and highs, and that can happen with even if you don't have any leave, for sick leave or parental leave. We also need organizations to really, really step up when it comes to fathers taking parental leave. There was a study that came out a few years ago that showed that of UK fathers, less than a third, over a third did not take paternity leave because they felt like their jobs expected them to be in. And there's other research that finds that women also feel those same demands. They just choose not to meet them with whatever penalties that conflates. So it is definitely hard. I think one of the most important things we can do there is to step up what happens with people taking leave, because as you said, this is not just an issue of women taking care of young children, it's people taking time away from work for whatever reason, and that is very deeply ableist. And if you want specifically families, as your example was, there's a remarkable high proportion of women in STEM who have partners who are also in STEM academic careers, which means that universities can do a lot more in supporting men in taking leave. So it's not just women who do school runs. And something that can be done is setting, for example, meetings, regular meetings, departmental meetings between 10 and 3. So you got some space at each end for taking care of yourself, if that's what you need for your health, for doing school runs. A lot of women are often sandwich carers, which means they're caring for younger children and for family members above one generation. So there's a lot that can be done there in terms of how work is structured, because if you stop rewarding those who keep doing extra work, then you disadvantage those who only do their job. Can you read out loud Fiona's statements, Fiona?
Here, sorry. My colleague told her children that the reason she wasn't a professor was because their father was. So true that there isn't room for both in the current system. This needs to change.
Yeah.
I will say something I have 2 children who are 3 and 6, and when the first one was born, I took 4 months of leave, and then my husband took 4 months of leave after that. He's at Imperial, and Imperial paid him full salary. So I thought, perfect, this is the perfect system. Actually, what ended up happening is I took 4 months of full leave. And then when he then took 4 months, I was still working from home. I was breastfeeding, I was taking regular breaks. In fact, he published 3 papers in the 4 months, and he was doing the best he could. It's not that he was handing me the baby, but in fact, although on paper, it looks like he took a parental break, it still is not exactly what I took, which was, 4 months of nothing. And another, after that, 1 year of trying to juggle everything and doing my job quite badly. It's difficult.
It really is. And then
Yeah.
how we measure success then becomes hugely important, because if you only measure very recent success,
Yeah.
and people don't have the benefits of being part of a network, so you don't have as much work in the pipeline that maybe other people can finish. If you have these periods of leave, it becomes very, very disadvantaged. And if you can't enjoy any benefit of having done well in the past and getting some credit, like we saw the paper that where women are judged for their actual performance and men are judged against their potential to perform. You see all this kind of bad decision making coming together.
So the next question is, Mante, would you like to turn on your microphone? Maybe I'll ask it.
Sorry.
Yeah, you're here. Hi, I can hear you.
Sorry, I can't turn on my camera because I'm at work, but nonetheless, thanks a lot for the talk. I think it's very helpful that people do research on this, because we can then use these arguments in industry or academia to our bosses to say this has been researched, so we can actually justify our claims and complaints. So you have mentioned at some point during the talk that many of the professors that you have interviewed had volatile careers that included being in and out of the industry. I'm not 100% sure if the jobs in the industry were in STEM subjects, but I was wondering if you picked up any of the themes in terms of comparative difficulties in career progression in academia versus industry experience in STEM, and whether their choices to come back in academia or maybe stay in industry were driven by these differences in difficulties.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I actually have a whole theme ready on that. It's just there wasn't any space for it in my thesis. But there is a lot of different ways where academia and industry are different. So first of all, in academic careers, most people have a lot more autonomy. And although it's certainly not true for everyone, especially on research contracts, many contracts in academia are permanent, whereas industry careers often follow projects. So you have some sense that there's a willingness to continue a project, but you work on a series of fixed term contracts as your career, with less autonomy over what you do, but then they pay more. And they often offer more training. That seems to be kind of the key distinction of the career process. So your career would then develop by having done one project, you can apply for a more senior position in your next post, but you would typically not be internally promoted the way people often are in academia. It would happen externally by applying for a new post, which eventually becomes more and more and more senior. And that's the thing about professor. It's a very academic title, even though it's sometimes also used in research institutes. So it's a way to express expertise, but you can be very senior and have an expert role in industry without having that same title, because the title can vary between companies and sectors and subject specialisms. So yeah, it's different and very difficult to compare and contrast academic careers that way, because the titles wouldn't match up and the salaries would already be different. But that's the main outline of the differences in careers. Does that answer your question?
Yes, to some extent. I think where I was coming from is I looked at this high-level statistics that you provided. So for professors, we have about 11% in mathematics, for example. And in industry, I would think similar level of expertise would be executive directors or managing directors, let's say in finance. I mean, they obviously earn probably more, but I think we have a lot lower percentages, particularly in quant finance, what I'm looking at. And I was trying to see why, basically, why is that? And what do we do maybe slightly better academia? And maybe you already answered a question to that it is maybe more natural progression within the same field versus in industry, you probably need to put yourself for the next project and the next project and the next project, which probably women are not as good at that. In general, it's more, or like this gender bias maybe kicks in a bit more, because as someone noted to me actually, lately at work, is that promotion in industry is a bit of a popularity context, or especially in technical fields where you're not judged based on how much money you make, or maybe, you know, for the job. It's not like, you know, trading or something like that, where you actually can earn money and can show this is how much I've added value. So if it's something more technical like programming or quant finance, or I don't know, there are other STEM careers. I'm obviously mainly familiar with this one. So I was trying to kind of draw these parallels and see where we can learn from industry versus academia, you know, from each other, because we clearly have similar difficulties in terms of diversity. But yes, it does answer the question to some extent. Actually, I'd be interested to read that chapter you missed out of your...
I'll write it up as a paper.
Yes.
But I thought it's really cool to hear how all these professors compare. And they also, as a separate note, really related to the career progression as such. It was, in terms of culture, it was raised that in industry, there's a lot more accountability at senior levels, and there's a lot of antisocial behavior that you can see in senior academic staff that they seem to get away with that would not fly in industry careers. And I would hoping if there's a culture of accountability, that would translate to more diversity, equality, diversity, and inclusion, but we'll see.
Yes, I think we're still far behind, but yes, maybe one day. Thank you.
The next question is by Candice, and it says, do you have a feel for how many of your interviewees were promoted the first time they applied, and what was their experience if they were turned out that first time? And also great talk.
Hey Candice, happy birthday. I've got...
happy birthday.
Yeah, Candice had a birthday this weekend. Let's see. I've got some statistics on it actually. Just descriptive stuff. I'm finding it now. It was more common than you think that women didn't get promoted on the first try. Let's see. I can say that, for example, out of the 71, only 8 got promoted externally. So they got promoted by moving to a different university. And the rest of them got promoted internally. So even though I said it's so much easier to get promoted externally, that's not the way they did it. Can't find it now. I'm sorry, I'll send it to you when I do find it. But yeah, it was fairly common that the professors didn't get promoted on the first try. I'm sure I'll see it as soon as I close this meeting. Some of them applied up to 5 times. So yeah, a whole lot of not giving up. That's the key bit. It was recommended as an interpretation, not necessarily in their own experience, but just what they thought was happening around them, that women wait too long to apply. And so they could have been promoted earlier, but then they don't apply early enough, so they wait sometimes a decade longer than they need to, was an assumption. But obviously I'm not collected enough data to make any inferences on that. But it's a very good thing if women apply early and get rejected and then apply again, because that is better, because you don't lose anything. If you apply for a promotion and you don't get it, if it's an external job, that might be different, but internally you still have your job, you're still doing a great job. It can be used to negotiate a higher wage, for example, because you might get feedback on where you stand in your role compared to the one up, or sometimes two up. That was more common than you think, that women went from, for example, senior lecturer, bypassed reader and went straight to professor, even before university started restructuring what happens around reader and associate professor roles. But it's a very good thing that women apply if that is a stereotype that they don't. And you can then negotiate, well, if I meet some of the criteria for professor and I'm a senior lecturer now, what can you meet me halfway? Can you offer me more money? Can I do some more senior roles if you give me this? And you can then get a clearer path of what exactly is missing or is not quite there yet in your current CV that you can change. And sometimes it's the way the application is rewritten because the criteria is not clear, the promotion process isn't clear, and you learn from that. But it's very common to apply and not get it on the first try, and it's much better, I think, that women apply several times rather than wait a long time, because it's not just your wage at the moment, it becomes your pension, it becomes, it contributes to the national pay gap, the gender pay gap. When you think the gender pay gap is big, the race pay gap is enormous. So I think even though it sucks to get an application rejected, I think it's great if women do. Does that answer your question?
Yes, perfect. There we go. The next question is more of a comment by Jen and Komal afterwards. The discussion about motherhood and maternity leave. So Jen is a postdoc on a temporary contract, and so planning to be a mother, it feels like it's not an option, because if the funding runs out, what next? So she won't even be able to take maternity leave if she won't be employed. And is there a way to solve this? And then Komal said, okay, yeah, my thoughts exactly. This is a major issue on for researchers with soft funding and short-term projects and contracts. And some funders cover maternity, but not all of them.
Yeah, so these are all very excellent points, and it highlights the precarity of being on a research career. And it's one of the reasons why women fall out. Even though I interviewed only women who had stayed in academia and become professors, even if they've been doing other things in between, they highlighted how they sin women just not thinking it's a good enough job, even though you get to have fun, you get to have autonomy, you get to be curious for a living doing all this research. It's not enough when you don't have the job security, because it's not just that you can't have children, which is something many people want, and that's fine. It's fine if you don't, but if you do, that should be your choice. It also impacts whether you can get a mortgage, which is difficult to get on a fixed term contract, which means that you stay in this kind of very loose attachment to where you are, and your plans become very different. It can be easy to become promoted on a research track, but you have that precarity, and it's definitely not on. There is some pressure to work with UKRI, and they've gone from offering no maternity leave to some maternity leave, but it's the larger issue is then the precarity of the constantly being funded by grants, and you don't really have a steady job. It's a funny thing with academia that you have to get money so you can do your job, and if you don't win that money, you can't do your job. You can't pay for it yourself. It's another thing. But yeah, putting pressure on the funders is a big thing. and I don't know what leverage they would respond to. In my experience working with UKRI, for example, when they had the COVID funding, and I think it was £4.3 million divided into 3 grants, and one of the panel members deciding who gets those grants won 3 of the 6 grants. And we complained, and the response was essentially, we have done nothing wrong and we need to apologise for nothing. I think you need some senior leverage in that, in working with how to influence UKRI, but it needs to come from them, and there needs to be partnered with universities that offer permanent contracts. And there are some grants that have been more designed towards that, like I've been told the Future Leader Fellowship, as exclusive as that is, it's pretty much set with a condition that if we as the UKRI pay a person for 5 years for this fellowship, then the university who hosts them have to offer them a permanent contract. So universities and UKRI can kind of leverage each other there to increase the job stability and job security.
Thank you very much. Next up is Marcus. Would you like to turn on your microphone?
Yep.
Hi, Marcus.
Hi. Thanks for a really illuminating talk. You mentioned just a couple of minutes ago about people applying and being unsuccessful, and I wondered if there's any data on the rates comparing men and women in that.
Oh, I would love to do that. Because even though we see that it's easier for men to get promoted, it's not all men. One of the things that came up sometimes in my interviews is that they had identified that the promotional criteria in the processes were too opaque. And so they set up workshops for women because women said they were opaque. But then a lot of men came knocking on the door asking to join too, because they also found that the processes and criteria were far too vague to know what to do with. So I'd like to see what would actually happen. The stereotypical understanding is that men are more comfortable with self-promotion. They're more comfortable taking a risk. There is some evidence, there's a systematic review done that found that women are less comfortable with emotional risks. And it is very emotional and personal when you, especially for the professorial promotion, the bigger promotions, the documents and the process is very onerous. It's a huge time-consuming effort, and it's not something people willingly do if they know they're not going to be at least likely to be successful.
But you're right,
I don't
there's a real benefit.
I only interviewed women, and they have their impression of what it's like for men, but people don't often share their failures. We talk about when we've done well, and that's great. We should be able to do that. We should be able to celebrate our victories, but we're not so open when it doesn't go well. One of my favorite things was when I went in my early PhD days, went to conference, and one of the presenters had his CV of failures, and he presented all the jobs he didn't get, so all the PhDs he applied for didn't get, and then all the jobs he didn't get, promotions he didn't get. But I haven't seen any kind of large scale data on it. And I think we find that the granularity that we're lacking in these larger data sets would be reflected there. That it's not just about gender differences. There are other factors that contribute to who is more successful on the first attempt. And how many years I think would be interesting also to look at between completing the PhD and then getting promoted to professor.
Thank you. And I just wanted to add one more comment as well about, it was also just discussed about UKRI, and we recently discussed about whether postdocs can work part-time, for example, and we'd like to raise that with UKRI, as well as things like maternity and precarity, and finding the pathways to do that is, I mean, that's kind of an open question. We were thinking of going through like university senior management somehow or something. There must be routes to communicate about those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that wouldn't just open up the field for women who are mothers. It would open up jobs for people with disabilities.
Yeah.
I think there is loads to win from that.
Yeah, I mean, it's about, equity as well, isn't it? I can work 80% FTE. Why can't a postdoc do that?
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Thanks very
Well,
much.
that's a great point. Well said.
Thank you. Irene?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Julie, for your presentation. I just wanted to bring some insights that I got from my research. I'm doing a research on idiosyncratic deals in STEAM startups, and one of the outputs that we have seen is, for sure, gender is a moderator, but as you said, sometimes females tend to negotiate different things, such as what Marcos says, okay, flexibility in terms of a schedule, of place of work, rather than negotiating the salary itself. So I think there is also like a future research there, on what things females in STEAM, in science, technology, engineering, math, negotiate, and how what are the outputs that they get out of there. So this field, which is ideals, is something that is not that developed in STEAM, and potentially there are some synergies there to future research. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. That's a great point. It's very perceptive.
Thank you. Next one, Beth says that her institution does compulsory application for promotion for everyone on an annual basis. I should be interested to know if people think this would help more widely. That's the question. Is this a good idea?
I think it's a very good thing to formally structure promotions so that people know that they're happening and that what the process would be. I hope that when people are made to apply every year, that first of all, that is workloaded, because that is not an easy task. And second of all, that you have the relevant support and you have access to information and guidance in completing that application. And that also the criteria, whoever makes the decisions around who gets promoted, are considered more broadly in just that very narrow section of research success. Training is patchy but improving. That's good. Because it's not good to be told that you have to apply for a promotion every year, but you're not workloaded for it, and you don't know quite what the criteria are, or that you know what they are, but they're completely unattainable. But there's a lot of things that have to be done together for that to work well. But I hope that they have put guidance, and that over the next few years you'll see a shift in who then becomes who fills these senior positions in your department.
Thank you. The flip side, I have to justify the flip side. Oh, Marcus says that the flip side, this can also be perceived as having to justify your role on a regular basis. So
yeah, you could potentially end up with a very short-term view that we talked about earlier, that disadvantages those who've had a recent care leave or sick leave, that if you're looking at very short time periods of performance instead of your whole contribution across your career, it could disadvantage women.
Beth says some people find it very painful, but it has vastly increased promotion in underrepresented groups, but might also make people feel quite fed up if they're forced to apply and keep not getting it.
Yeah, so if it works.
Oh, sorry, that one was from Beth, one was by Candice, sorry.
Yeah. So if people have the support, then it should work. If you're just keeping all the aspects of the structural inequalities and make people face it more often, then you're not solving anything. And like it was raised before, it could impact how people feel about applying for a promotion if they feel like I'm not going to get to, why do I have to do this again? Or worrying that they're constantly justifying their current role, not just applying for the next one. These quick and easy fixes that one rule applies for everyone, one way to do everything, it very rarely works. You need the full commitment across the board. So you need people to have space in their workloads to do this, to do the training that makes them promotable to the next level if that's something they need. And they need a proper support and more formalization in what the criteria and the processes are. And because that hadn't been available, that's why the social support is so important in the research I did.
There's an additional comment by Beth who says, yeah, that's a very good point. It can become repeated trauma, but they are developing criteria to make sure the criteria respect and value a wide range of contribution types. It's a long haul. I'm going to jump in with a question since there's not one right now. And I guess the research you presented is from UK academia, but obviously the people don't have to be originally from the UK, but it's UK academia. What do you know about other countries who have better or worse records, in fact, in terms of all around equality? And well, what measures, I know, for example, Germany, they have much more positive discrimination. Has that worked? What do you know about?
So the countries I'm maybe the most familiar with is you hear about like the states having tenure track, and they seem to stay at this precarious pre-permanent contract for a much longer stage, which would increase all the precarity that we have discussed. You need to justify your position much longer. You need to be able to survive on a series of fixed-term contracts. And the problem with fixed-term contracts is that it's become almost a financial privilege, because you might need to move physically, geographically, relocate between fixed-term contracts, and that costs money. And it's not always covered, these moving expenses in fixed-term contracts. So that's something I don't consider too desirable, although the academic system in the US seemed to be a bit different anyway. I'm from Norway, that's my country. And we had a law that came in a few years ago. The last time we had a Labour government, they made a law to say that on all boards in Norway, you had to have at least 40% female representation, which is based on a gender binary, which is problematic because gender is more than just two men and women. There are a lot more gender identities that were not recorded at the time, but the idea was that if you have a gender binary, you might have 5 people in a board. So if you say 50, then you can't have 2.5 women sitting on the board, so 40%. And it did increase some culture, but it didn't have the trickle down effect they thought it would. So they thought, for example, that if you have a demand for a very strong representation of women, it would trickle down to other jobs and other decisions, making it easier for women to be equally represented in that, because we're not looking for handouts and to have an easier time. It's just the current system means that it's harder, disproportionately harder for women, people of colour and people with disabilities to progress. It did a little bit of good for the gender pay gap because more women got in these positions, and it has a very good effect for the women who were there because it's easier to continue to have these very, very senior positions if you already had one. It's just getting your foot in the door in the first place. And then we got a right-wing government who took it out because it was not necessary, they felt. So there's been a bit of research done on that, but the problem is a lot of how you measure career progression, how long the precarity of the early career stages last, and when you can get that permanent contract. Germany, I don't know if they still do it, but they've had these indirect barriers, like there's something you need to pass to be able to apply for a professor. Anyone know what that's called?
Habilitation, I think, is that right?
Yes, that's one. So for example, Lisa Meitner, who's a fantastic scientist, was not able to, she was allowed to apply for a professor, but she wasn't allowed to apply for that Habilitation. It was me butchering that pronunciation, sorry, Germany. So there are these indirect barriers, and I think the more indirect barriers and then kind of hidden rules and all of that makes it harder. Some other professors talked about career progression as playing the game, and it shouldn't be that. It shouldn't be guessing a secondary set of rules and interpretations and just to progress, because if you're contributing, that should be acknowledged, and it benefits the university, it benefits you, it benefits everyone. It's a good thing.
Thank you very much. Hao, you have a question?
Yes, thank Julia for the great talk. I have one question. So in your opinion, what is the general trend of this working environment of the female or underrepresented group of academics in UK? Do you think it's improving or deteriorating?
I think it is very slowly improving. There is more attention placed on it now, so you can see that even though UKRI has removed the Athena's One criteria, Athena's One still exists, and people, organizations and departments and institutes still submit to Athena's One, which means they're committing to making some recognition that there are gender inequalities and that they want to do something about it, which is a very good thing. None of these changes have come easily, and I interviewed professors who started their careers in the 70s, and they said, we fought for this, we've marched in the streets, we changed the laws, why is this still an issue? But it takes a long time, and it's important to keep in mind that even though this research is specifically about women are not the only marginalized group, not the only group that's disadvantaged, and the ultimate goal of what we're doing is to make sure that academia and research is a space where everyone can access and contribute and thrive, and not just women.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. A very nice note potentially to end on. Do we have any more questions? We have another maybe 10 minutes to spare. So if there are any more questions, please put them in the chat. I have, you know what, I have one more question. Can I ask it? So, you know, I'm in a position where I mentor junior females. And I remember when I was starting out, there were some, not official mentors, but there were people, so when I applied for my very first grant, one of the comments was, how do we know she's going to do the work herself? And I didn't get the grant, but there was that comment explicitly. How do we know? Because I had, as a partner, there was somebody who was more senior and who never does anybody else's work, to clarify, but that doesn't matter. There was that comment, and I was like, whatever, it's a shitty comment. But I remember a senior female said to me, this is sexist, this is because you're female. And at the time, this went over my head, and I don't think I appreciated these barriers that were kind of around until I am where I am now, where I can see it. But how do we mentor junior female academics in a meaningful and an effective way? Could I have handled that in a different way? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think that you didn't handle it wrong. And it's a very good point that some of the professors I interviewed felt like there are no barriers for women because they couldn't see them. And if you don't look at the big data set, if you don't look at the big data of all the staff in the UK, of all the students, you don't see the leaky pipeline, you just see your own environment. It's hard to pick up on where the inequalities lie and how you're being discriminated against. Because this really is many and little ways. It seems with race, there are more overt discrimination than there is for sexism, but mentoring is a very good way to support each other one of the professors I interviewed had worked very hard for a very long time to create a better work environment where she worked in her department, and she just faced endless defeats in trying to make change. And so she decided, well, if I can't change the policies, I'm gonna she was like, she went to war with mentoring, where she like aggressively identified every early career woman and she offered them all mentoring, and she very in detail sought them out, and she made sure they had knowledge, that they had support in her, that they could come for questions, they could come, it can be like you said, you have a grant, you might have someone you got to advise about grants for, and then someone else for something else, making sure they're not alone. I've had very, very good mentoring that have very much changed the way I see my career, because I'm now at a post-92 university, and the opportunities that are available other places aren't necessarily available here. And mentoring has changed the way I think about things. And again, it becomes very important to think broadly about mentoring. So it's not just senior people mentoring junior people, and then you can learn from peers as well. And especially if you come to new positions, like the senior positions with leadership, that is maybe taken on for the first time, you need support in that. But just making sure that early career women have someone to go to for advice, and you had someone say to you, this is sexist, this is not okay. That is important to have that called out. And if you're just kind of dealing with what can I do with the comments in front of me and not really judging them in that light, that experience can help you save years of looking at comments before you come to the same conclusion. Even if you can't change the way UKRI does give their feedback. It's such a stupid comment.
Whatever, you know, this. Yes, it is a stupid comment, but what can you do? It is what it is.
I do want sometimes these comments, if the people who give them were accountable for them, like, what do you mean with this?
Yeah, but it's an anonymous process. So, I mean, maybe in retrospect, I should have made some kind of inquiry. Who knows? It doesn't matter. It's in the past. But the point is, you know,
but it's a great thing. If you do mentoring now, that's a very good thing to do. And that's a very good thing that individuals can do. And not just seeking out the mentoring, but be mentors as well.
Yeah. We have another question by Beatrice.
It's not a question, but a comment precisely about what you said about that comment of how do we know that she's going to do the work herself. I think it's a very difficult issue for women who have partners who are in the same field as they are. And you have to be extremely careful to make it clear that's your work and that maybe your partner, your husband had nothing to do with it. Because there is that impression. My husband is also a mathematician. And we're very, very careful to like, oh, we need to make sure that like the things that we do together, like it's very clear, like if I was the main person doing the thing, make it very clear somehow that it was me, because the natural assumption is that if we do something together, it was him doing all the work and he just put my name just to do me a favor. Like, unfortunately, there's still that perception.
I'm sorry I didn't go through that. That's absolutely rubbish.
Yeah. Last year when, sorry.
He has to guard himself against being credited for your work compared to the other way around.
Yeah, the other way around is not a problem.
If you check the reporting last year when the economist Esther Duflo and her husband Abhijit, I forget his surname, when they won the Nobel Prize together, a lot of newspaper outlets were just reporting his name and the wife, and I wanted to punch them. Anyway. Yeah. One last question by Alex, maybe slightly off topic. He says, it was revealed this year that the pandemic increased the gender pay gap. And do we observe a similar trend in academia in the UK?
I think it's early to say, but we can safely expect it to happen. I think the pandemic paused a lot of things for a long time for many. And especially those who are early careers will be more, they'll be hit harder for that because of job precarity. But also because if you're a bit more established, you can have work in the pipeline that you can finish off. You can finish writing papers, you can look at what already you have got. Can you get anything else out of what you already have? You can write conference abstracts based on publications you already have written. But if you don't have anything like that to build on, and then everything got hit by a big pause button, I think we'll see a lot of disparity there. And I think it will affect not just gender, but also gender. It's a very good question.
Thank you. Do we have any last minute questions? Let me see, I don't think there's a hand up, is there? No.
Maybe not so much a question, but I just picked up on the topic you discussed about, credit for husband, etc. topic. I think a lot about what men can do to help us, and I think that's one of the areas when men as allies, how we frame them, and industry could actually contribute. And I think they do. In my personal experience, I would say my husband's my biggest fan, and I think in many cases, if men are more voiceful about these things, because a husband always, the family members who see you working know actually how much women can do, and if they're just more loud about this, I think that would help all the women in industry. Not necessarily, speaking about my own wife, but just saying out of experience they have. And my husband would always say, like, when I met you, I thought you were smarter than, things like these comments, and just that's where I think men could step in and be better allies in terms of speaking up for women and giving them credit, even if it's a female colleague, not necessarily a wife. Because I think we say it works with a husband-wife relationship, I think the same works if you just have two collaborators. You have a man and a woman, and you consider that men maybe contributed a lot. I really liked also the theme that you picked up in your research, which commented that we look at men more in terms of potential perspective from potential, how much they can contribute, versus a woman, how much she achieved. And I think that contributes towards how you also read research, and you consider that such a great idea. Maybe he did not develop it to the end, but it's a brilliant idea. Whereas I think from a woman's perspective, you expect everything to be done end to end perfectly with no flaws. And I think I would like to see more men actually raising that, commenting on that, because they see that, they just sometimes think, that's what at least I've heard from my friends who are male in industry. What's the point of us making a comment? There is a point. They should just know that it helps, even psychologically. Like, I do not think I experience personally, because I'm in industry, like no one would say your husband sits behind your back and does all the coding. But I think it's psychologically, I sometimes feel that way, because I'm partially studying, partially working. I feel like if I go to a class with my husband, he sits next to me, I think everybody thinks he does everything for me. I have that in my mind. I do not think people think that way, but it helps psychologically if people actually just raise that. But yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. It's very insightful.
Thank you. That's a great comment. Men can be great allies. We need people who are majorities, whoever the majority is, to be those allies and advocate for change, to allow more people to participate. But about the how a lot of women in STEM often have partners in STEM, even though men in STEM have partners from everywhere, women in STEM have partners in STEM. They became often invaluable resources for the women who I interviewed, those who had that kind of partnership and that support. And often when they weren't sure about going through promotion and what to do, the husbands or partners would often be the ones to say, if you were in my department, you'd be a professor a long time ago. I'm surprised this is done this way in your department, because it's done differently and it works this way in mine. And there's something about having someone who knows the full aspects of your job. And if you can have a difficult day and you come home and you say, this happened and this is my response to it and this is how I feel, they know the full context and they know exactly what you mean. That's a huge, huge beneficial support to have.
Thank you. We have one question from Helen and then a quick one, if we have time, by Brett, and I think then we have to.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to follow up quickly on that point about husbands having the ability to really help. So my husband left academia, went into industry. He joined a small company that was entirely male and hadn't thought about diversity at all. And he's been there just over a year and they're now completely gender balanced. That's entirely his effort because he's been following what I've been doing. So he's hired, I think, all female bar one so far. And it's just astonishing. But actually the reason that I put my hand up was on the gender pay gap. There's a lot that an institution can do here. So we think the pandemic's going to make it worse, but actually UCL had mitigation for the pandemic explicitly in the promotions process to say, look, we're going to be flexible. And if people have ended up doing more teaching or more something, or more this, more citizenship to keep the wheels on when we all went remote, we want to respect that. And as a result, we had more women than men promoted last year, despite only being about 15% women in this department. So it worked very well, and it allowed us to really reward all of the people who did what needed to be done and didn't prioritize their own research careers. And I'm really grateful for that as head of department.
That's fantastic. The key then was that you formalized it. And that's where they often fall short, because it becomes one person's idea, but it's not formalized in any documents. It's not formalized as policy, even if it's for a short period, like as a response to the pandemic. That's great. And it's important that it's followed up with proper promotions. Cambridge recently had some emails gone around. I know it happened in some colleges. I don't know if it happened in all colleges, where people who were readers were told, you're now a professor, congratulations. Nothing changes. Your workload is the same. Your pay is the same, but you're a professor now. So they just created extra tiers within the professorial role. But it's not like a real upgrade because the pay gap stays the same. But they get, I guess, some kind of recognition abroad, maybe. I don't know. It just seems like when you do these very quick and easy solutions that isn't followed through with good thought of how it would impact people and who would it really contribute or benefit, then it doesn't really work. But what you've done, it sounds like a great idea, because we need people to really prioritize teaching and academic and citizenship. And there's been lots of fantastic teaching going on during the pandemic, and how quickly some universities managed to switch to online has been very, very impressive. And I know that a lot of people are working stupid hours to keep everything going so that it's rewarded, because there was a financial issue in the beginning of the pandemic. Some people were let go, people were asked to go on part-time contracts. And they often, some universities had promotion freezes and no one got promoted. So it's a huge deal that you've not only done the promotions, but that you considered the promotion in terms of the demands of the last year. That's very, very well done.
Thank you. There is a question by Brett, who's actually Candice, I think, but I'm not sure we have time to answer it. The question is actually relating to, are there any quick fixes we can do before the long-term strategies kind of pay out?
Formalize your promotional processes and criteria and make it accessible. And give people support at every single stage, not just in the beginning or when they're new to it. The university or institution. Just make sure everyone has support always, everywhere.
Cool. Well, just in time. Thank you very, very much, Julie. We all have a lot of food for thought that I hope we will take back and implement in some way. So can we give Julie a round of applause, please? I'm going to do a real one. Thank you very much for taking the time, and good luck with finishing up. and I look forward to meeting you in person at some point. The session is recorded. Hopefully we'll post the link as soon as it's ready. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us or Julie directly. Thank you very much. Nice to see you all.
Thank you for coming.